So glad to have you here. First question to you. Are you surprised by intelligence reports that Russia is meeting with more resistance than it expected?
This is the best news I've heard in a long time, but I'm not surprised. Ukrainian soldiers have learned and grown so much since 2014. And I think that what we're seeing is our Ukrainian armed forces overperforming and Russian forces underperforming. I think Matt has done a good job of laying that out. None of the objectives have been met on time. Almost every single city and airfield that was targeted is either still in Ukrainian hands or was lost after a much tougher fight than was expected. And what we're seeing in Kyiv, frankly, at this point, and I'm reluctant to predict how long things last, but I don't think it's feasible that Kyiv is actually going to fall. This is a huge city. Russian forces, I mean, it will take a lot of people just to encircle it, let alone start clearing all these huge buildings. Now, you, I think, earlier made a very good point that because of this, the Kremlin is going to be frustrated that they are falling behind. They're going to start looking at their logistics, which I think are going to be really under stress, fuel, ammunition, especially rockets and missiles. And so they're going to potentially accelerate. And we all remember what happened to the city of Grozny during the Chechen War, where Russia basically leveled the city. And so I think it's going to be a tough fight in there. But I actually believe that Ukraine is going to prevail in keeping Russia from capturing this very important city.
Let's very much hope you are right, sir. Let me ask you about the impact of NATO's unprecedented activation of its response force. What can that have on this conflict?
Two things. First of all, you're right, it is unprecedented, but it also shows 30 nations are committed to this, because the NRF would not be getting activated and deployed if you didn't have all 30 nations. That's critical. And of course, that's the last thing that Putin wanted, was to see all 30 of us sticking together. And I would attribute much of that to the diplomatic effort by the United States over the past several months. But this is also important because tomorrow there's going to be a referendum in Belarus. And that referendum on its constitution is going to remove the word neutrality from the constitution. It's going to welcome Russian nuclear weapons into Belarus, and it's going to give Lukashenko immunity for life. And I would say the chances of this referendum passing are about 99.9%. So what this means is that we're now going to have Russian troops full-time in Belarus with nuclear weapons. And that's why this NRF deployment is so important, and why our allies in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are so anxious to see a stronger NATO presence and a stronger American presence there.
General, you mentioned the 30 NATO nations completely in sync, uniform, and that might have come as a surprise to Vladimir Putin. What about Kazakhstan refusing his request to send troops to help in his attempted takeover of Ukraine? How surprising must that be to him?
Well, this is a reflection, of course, the difference between NATO, where 30 nations are bound together by shared values, a defensive alliance, whereas this coalition that Moscow is trying to bring together, where they are not bound by shared values, but by fear, threat, or some sort of leverage amongst the leadership. I think even Armenia is also hesitant. Belarus is not providing troops, although Belarus is allowing Russian Air Force and helicopters to fly from bases in Belarus, and they're providing logistical support. But I think that you made a very good point. Kazakhstan, which just was saved by the Kremlin, is not willing to show any support, because this is not a values-based coalition.
Sir, Ukraine's overwhelmingly, by comparison, tiny army has managed to slow Russia's roll. It no way compares to Russia's, but I want to play some of what retired General David Petraeus said yesterday about the first 24 hours of this fight. Take a listen, sir.
They'll defeat the Ukrainian conventional forces. That's, again, not in question. It's how long it takes, how determined can they be as they are taking very tough losses. You know, they lost more on day one, the Ukrainians, I believe, very close to the worst month of American losses during the height of the surge in Iraq, which is the bloodiest period of our time there.
So, which brings into question, how long can the Ukrainian military hold off the Russian military? For what length of time, what duration do you think they can perform at the level they have?
Well, with all respect to my former commander, I'm going to disagree with him. I'm not going to say that it's basically irrefutable or inevitable that Russia will eventually overwhelm. For sure, they have a massive advantage in terms of air power and in sea power. But the land forces, what we're seeing, I mean, that's not 850,000 soldiers like from the 101st Airborne or the 82nd Airborne. So gross numbers are not always a great indicator. The vulnerability for Russia is their logistical tail. I mean, all these tanks, I mean, they burn up a lot of fuel, all the armored vehicles, a lot of fuel. And of course, they're expending massive amounts of ammunition, unlike anything we did in Iraq or Afghanistan. So I just don't believe that they have the capability, especially the further they go from Russian sovereign territory and from Belarus, that they will be able to maintain this. And I think these convoys of big fuel trucks, for example, that have to follow the tanks, these things, they are very vulnerable. And I think we're going to see more and more reports of these convoys being hit.